Go ahead.
I would like to welcome you today to our Beef and Forage focused webinars. Again, this is a series of webinars that we hold on the first and third Tuesdays of the month. Today I'd like to welcome Dr. Amy Schmidt. She's going to be visiting with us about some of the regulations that producers need to be aware of, especially under the drought conditions, as they can maybe consider confining animals and feeding them in a situation where they normally wouldn't. Dr. Schmidt?
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron. It's nice to be on here today. I'm an assistant professor in the Biological Systems Engineering Department at UNL, and want to cover some of the issues today that might be of concern to you if you're getting ready to confine some livestock during the drought. So just to give you an overview, this information is relevant to you if you currently have only pasture-based cattle, but are considering confining them. If you currently confine some livestock, but you don't confine enough to require a permit, or if you currently have a permit, but need to confine additional cattle. And so the topics that I'll cover include what determines whether or not you need an inspection and or a permit, how long can you keep your cattle in a quote-unquote temporary lot, what do you do if you need an inspection or permit, and what other rules might apply to your situation. So the first thing I want to define is what is an AFO versus a CAFO in Nebraska. So an AFO is an animal feeding operation, and a CAFO is concentrated animal feeding operation. So by the federal regulation, an AFO, or an animal feeding operation, is defined by having at least one animal confined for 45 days or more over a 12-month period to an area where vegetation is not maintained. So you basically have animals in an area with a stocking density high enough that, that you can't maintain vegetation on it. Within Nebraska, then, we define AFOs based on the number of animals, so you can have a small, medium, or large AFO. A small AFO is one where you have fewer than 300 cattle or cow-calf pairs. A medium AFO is anywhere from 300 to 999 cattle or cow-calf pairs. And then a large AFO is 1,000 or more cattle or cow-calf pairs. The next step up then is a CAFO, and a CAFO is any operation that's already defined as an animal feeding operation, so the animals are confined for that 45 days or more, and then it meets one of the requirements on this next slide. So this is the federal EPA's regulatory definition of large, medium, and small CAFOs. So basically, if you are an animal feeding operation, a small one, so 300 or fewer animals that you have confined for that 45-day period, and you've been designated by the permitting authority, which in Nebraska is the Department of Environmental Quality, if you've been designated as a significant contributor of pollutants, so you've had discharge events from your site, they can make you, require you to get a permit and be considered a concentrated animal feeding operation versus just an AFO. So then the medium and large CAFOs are also based on the number of animals. So medium is 300 to 999, and again, if you've got the potential to discharge, so you have a route by which pollutants can leave the site and reach surface water. And then a large CAFO is based upon having 1,000 or more animals. And in the table that I show here, I've only showed cattle and cow-calf pairs for the sake of this presentation, but if you go to the link at the bottom of the page, that table contains those numbers for all the different animal sectors. So what does Nebraska require for AFOs? The small AFO is exempt from inspection and permits unless they've had a discharge or animals have some contact with surface water. And the thing about the small AFO is that unless there's a complaint that leads inspectors to come out there and follow up, they're not coming out looking for these smaller operations that might have a discharge occurring. For medium and large, these operations, based on the number of animals they have to request an inspection from the DEQ if they are not currently covered by a permit, or if they haven't previously been exempted from a permit, or if they're expanding and changing their operation in some way. The inspection fees are shown here. $100 for small AFOs, $200 for medium, and $500 for large. And there's a form available from DEQ that is for requesting the inspection of an AFO. And so the one thing I want you to keep in mind is just the fundamental focus of regulations, and that is to recognize manure as a source of nutrients and a potential pollutant to surface waters. So as long as you're keeping it contained, you should be in good shape from a regulatory standpoint. As far as the regulation for animal feeding operations, regardless of size, you're not allowed to discharge pollutants to waters of the state. And so you can't allow the animals to have direct contact with water, apply waste that could discharge, and I don't know why that just forwarded. And there's no exemption to this based on the size of the animal feeding operation. So what are waters of the state? This is the long definition from the Title 130 of the Nebraska Administrative Code. My simple definition is pretty much anything other than a containment that is designed to store manure is considered waters of the state. So anything, farm ponds, dry or intermittent streams, road ditches, anything that carries water or stores water is considered waters of the state. So I've got a few different scenarios here that I want to discuss, and hopefully we'll cover most of the situations that could be encountered by producers in Nebraska. This first one, let's say the farmer has 450 cattle or cow-calf pairs. The number's really not relevant, but they plan to confine those for less than 45 days, or they have a lot area that they're designating that can be left open so the animals still have access to pasture. So essentially they're not really confined just to that area. In that situation, it's not considered an animal feeding operation because, one, it's either less than 45 days that they'll be confined, or they're allowed to leave that lot area. So in that situation, there's really no need to request an inspection because this would not be considered an animal feeding operation. The general recommendation here would be if manure is accumulating, make sure that it's not discharging from the site so that it doesn't trigger a complaint from a neighbor or someone that's passing by. And don't give it, EPA or NDEQ any reason to come out and inspect that site. Now, Jason Gross will talk in a couple of weeks here on siting considerations for these temporary lots. But I just wanted to mention here, not to locate these near streams or ponds or ditches or anywhere where the manure can easily run off and leave the site. So the next situation is similar. Now let's assume that you have, 450 cattle again, or cow-calf pairs, and you need to confine them for more than 45 days, and you are not able to leave the gate open to allow them to leave that lot and have access to a pasture area. In this situation, because of your animal numbers, you've become an AFO. So regardless of whether you have 25 animals or 500, you're still an AFO. You could be a small, medium, or large at that point, depending on the numbers. So once you become an AFO, if you have more than 300 animals in there, or 300 cow-calf pairs, you likely need to request an inspection from the DEQ. A situation where you would not need an inspection is if they've previously been out and inspected a facility where you were confining animals and they, I guess, clarified that you did not have the potential to discharge and therefore you were not required to have a permit. So if that inspection has been done before, you really wouldn't need to have another. But if this is a new confinement area, you would need to request that inspection from the DEQ. Now, how could you avoid that type of situation where you would be considered an animal feeding operation? One way would be to reduce that total confinement period to 45 days or fewer. The thing to keep in mind is that this isn't a 12-month rolling period, so you can't confine for 40 days, let them out for a day, and then stick them back in for another 40 days, because then you've got a total of 80 days there in that 12-month rolling period. Another option might be to increase the quote-unquote lot area, confine them to a larger area of your field where you could still manage them and be able to feed and do what you need to do up close with the animals there, but you can maintain vegetation on that area. Or you could rotate them among multiple paddocks or confinement areas so that you never have a situation where you're not maintaining a vegetative cover. So the last example situation I want to look at, these are situations where you'll likely need to request an inspection and may end up needing a permit or a permit modification if you are currently operating under an NPDES permit. So in the top example here, consider that you decide to confine animals for more than 45 days and you have a true feedlot situation, so it's a small enough area that you can't maintain vegetative cover. If you have more than 1,000 animals, you'll need to request an inspection. You would be considered a large AFO. And if the DEQ at that point determines you have a potential to discharge pollutants, they will require you to apply for a permit. On the other hand, if you can show that you have no potential to discharge, you can avoid having to get a permit, but it requires that inspection in order to make that designation. If you've got less than 1,000 animals, so 300 to 999, just like in the previous example, you would need to request an inspection because you would be considered a medium AFO at that point. Again, you could be required to get a permit if they show that you have a potential to discharge. But again, it comes back to picking an appropriate site, managing the manure correctly, and not showing that you have that potential for a discharge. So animals don't have contact with surface waters. There's not a direct link between that site and surface water. Just like I mentioned earlier, if you have fewer than 300 animals and you're confining in a feedlot situation, you're considered a small AFO, so there's no need in that situation to require an inspection. The only thing that could trigger that inspection would be having a discharge or a complaint against your operation. The second scenario here, if you currently have livestock confined, regardless of whether you're operating under a permit or you're below that permit threshold, if the addition of animals that you need to confine will total get you to a total of more than 1,000 head of animals confined, that triggers the need for you to apply for a new permit, have the inspection, or to revise a current permit. So if you're already operating under a permit and you decide to add more animals to your confinement situation, then that requires a permit revision because you're increasing the capacity of your animal feeding operation. So a couple options to consider here to avoid having to go through with that inspection and apply for the permit or apply for that permit revision. You might consider moving the animals to a location where they can have some pasture access, so that you're not actually confining them in the sense of in the definition of an AFO, or transferring some of those animals to a commercial feedlot. That's probably the more extreme example, but again, if you're looking to avoid having to go through the permitting process and you have that option available, it's something that could be considered. The other would be consider dividing that herd among multiple farms so that you don't have those 1,000 animals or animal pairs on any one farm. Now, the thing to keep in mind with that is that you can't really separate them into 3 or 4 different lots that are all under one entity's control, because those animal numbers are additive for a single farm. So you would really need to have them under different ownership on different farms for that to really work. So it's not an option just to move them into different confinement areas. So if any of these scenarios apply to you and you think that you probably need to have an inspection or a permit, your first step, you can certainly contact UNL Extension for assistance, and we can give you some guidance on whether your situation really falls under one of those areas of needing an inspection or a permit. And you can obviously contact the NDEQ, either your local office or the state office, and explain your situation to them, and they will let you know which of those requirements you might fall within. So some options for manure management, and like I mentioned, Jason Gross will talk about this a bit more in a couple of weeks as far as siting, but I think one of the most obvious choices would be locating that lot away from any sensitive areas so that you are reducing the opportunity to have discharges to waters of the state. Any manure that accumulates should be scraped and stockpiled or immediately applied, land applied. And you may have a situation where you need to construct a temporary catchment basin to collect runoff. One thing to keep in mind, if you do have a discharge, you need to report that to the NDEQ within 24 hours and provide a written report within 5 days. And this is regardless of whether you're operating under a permit currently or regardless of the number of animals that are confined. A discharge is a discharge and needs to be reported to the DEQ. This is taken from the Title 130, which is the Nebraska Administrative Code related to animal feeding operations. And I just wanted to make you aware of a couple of the manure management requirements that are within that code. The first one, just for small or medium CAFOs and any animal feeding operation, manure and manure products need to be stockpiled or applied at least 30 feet away from any downgradient streams or lakes, impounded waters, wells, any sort of surface or groundwater supply. For the larger CAFOs, there's a greater setback distance or the option of using a vegetated buffer. So the bottom line, in my opinion, is if you don't currently have a permit, try to keep the confinement period under 45 days. That's one way to avoid being considered an animal feeding operation. The other is to confine fewer than 300 animals or cow-calf pairs at any given operation or farm. And if it's possible, try not to completely confine the animals. So if there's a way to leave the gate open, you can have that feeding area where the animals come in and feed is delivered, but they have access to pasture, so they're not technically confined. If you currently have a permit, just keep in mind that any animals you plan to confine in addition to your current confinement situation, those would need to be added to your permit via permit revision. So there's really no way around that. You're adding to the capacity of that site, and so a permit revision would be required. Again, regardless of whether you're operating under a permit or not, if you're currently confining or you need to use some temporary confinement, the most important thing to keep in mind is to manage the manure to avoid discharges. Whether that's by siting it correctly, by scraping and hauling frequently, or having some sort of secondary containment. You're usually going to be in pretty good shape if you can just avoid having any discharges. So that's the overview that I have to present today, and certainly there are probably other scenarios that may be different from those that I presented and might require more site-specific evaluation, but this should give kind of a background and a basis on how to manage those animals and decide whether or not an inspection and or a permit might be necessary.
Amy, one question I would have, maybe you can bring some clarity to, is when it talks about maintaining vegetation, what does that mean? I'm just thinking about farm ground in Nebraska, and in a drought we may have some pieces of farm ground that we would normally be growing a crop on, but due to drought conditions we're not. Can we feed on those type situations? Can you help clarify that?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of a, I wouldn't say it's a real clear definition, and this is, the animal feeding operation definition is a federal regulation from the EPA that is enforced in Nebraska by DEQ, but their official definition, and I shortened it in the presentation here, but they say an animal feeding operation means a location or an area where livestock are stabled or confined and fed or maintained for 45 days or more in a 12-month period, and crops or vegetation or forage growth or post-harvest residues are not sustained in the normal growing season over any portion of the location. So in a situation, in a feedlot or a confined or concentrated area, it's pretty hard to sustain any vegetation, because of the traffic by the animals. As long as they're not kind of at a high stocking rate, if they're on a pasture and there's, normal growing season, meaning there's precipitation and conditions that are favorable for plant growth, I think, it's a pretty broad definition. So basically a pasture situation, whether you can really maintain crop growth during this dry season or not, that wouldn't be considered an animal feeding operation because you're not confining those animals and having a high stocking density. Does that kind of clear up?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I could just see a situation where you may have a piece of ground that you have a failed crop on, and you're looking at a way to try to, get the animals off of what we would call permanent pasture, or to not damage grass, but knowing you would farm that ground and then feeding the animals there. And so that's, I think, the question I was asking, and I think you brought some clarity to that.
Yeah, so I think if you have a crop field where you grew corn last fall, last growing season, and you are grazing that area during this time of year, that's an area where during the normal growing season there would be a crop. So that would not be considered confining them, and it wouldn't be defined as an animal feeding operation.
Right, and so I'm thinking of this spring and summer, if we don't get moisture and people are needing to maybe continue to feed cattle, if they had an area that was normally farmed and they fed cattle on that with the intent of growing a crop, later in the summer or fall, would that kind of situation be acceptable?
I think it would be, yeah. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't, and I don't